Picture this. It's 1966. You're a 19-year-old American infantryman crouched in a foxhole somewhere in the central highlands of Vietnam. The jungle around you is alive with muzzle flashes. Your position is being overrun, and then you hear it, a deep, resonant drone, like a commercial airliner lost in the wrong war. You look up, expecting nothing. What you see instead changes everything you thought you knew about combat. A river of red fire pours from the sky in an unbroken stream, so dense it looks like a solid beam of light connecting heaven and earth. The tree line that was killing you seconds ago simply stops. The enemy vanishes. The silence that follows is more shocking than the noise that preceded it. The aircraft circling above you is not a fighter. It is not a bomber. It is a Douglas DC-3, a passenger plane your grandfather might have flown on to visit relatives in Chicago. And it just erased an entire enemy company in less time than it takes to read this sentence. That aircraft, the AC-47, nicknamed Puff the Magic Dragon, would become one of the most requested, most feared, and most psychologically devastating weapons in the entire Vietnam War. Not because of its sophistication, not because it represented some breakthrough in aerospace engineering, because of what happened when you bolted 3 miniguns onto a plane designed to carry luggage and told it to fly in circles over a war zone. 2 questions sit at the heart of this story, and neither one has a simple answer. First, how did a World War II-era transport become the deadliest close air support platform of its generation? That is the design mystery, the tale of an idea so unconventional that most officers thought it was insane until they saw it work. Second, what was it like to be on the ground, American or Vietnamese, when Puff arrived overhead? That is the human experience, and it is far more disturbing and far more awe-inspiring than any statistic can convey. The story of Puff the Magic Dragon is not just a story about firepower. It is a story about a weapon so devastating that disciplined enemy units, hardened soldiers who had fought for decades, would break and run at the sound of its engines alone. And it is a story about the thin line between salvation and slaughter, because the men who flew Puff did so in an aircraft with almost no armor, flying low enough to be killed by a well-aimed rifle shot. But to understand how a cargo plane became a dragon, we need to go back to the beginning, to the jungles that were swallowing an American war effort whole. If you're fascinated by the untold stories behind history's most devastating weapons, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more where this came from. Now, let me take you back to the early 1960s, to a war America was quietly losing in the dark. The fundamental tactical crisis of the early Vietnam War was one of geometry and time. American forces had air superiority, absolute uncontested dominance of the sky with fast jets like the F-100 Super Sabre and the F-4 Phantom. On paper, this should have been decisive. In reality, these aircraft were poorly suited to the war actually being fought beneath them. The enemy did not mass in open fields or drive armored columns down highways. The Viet Cong hid beneath triple canopy jungle. They moved at night. They struck isolated outposts with overwhelming local force, then melted away before conventional air power could respond. By the time a fast mover arrived on station, screaming in at 500 knots, the attack was often over, and when jets did engage, their speed meant they had seconds over target. A single strafing pass, then a long looping return for another. Against guerrillas dispersed in dense vegetation, this was like using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito you could not see. The specific nightmare was night defense. Small American or South Vietnamese outposts scattered across the countryside, sandbag walls, concertina wire, a few dozen defenders, were islands in a sea of hostile territory. Dense jungle foliage that obscured everything by day became impenetrable blackness by night. Traditional close-air support was nearly useless in these conditions. Outposts were being overrun with alarming regularity, and the defenders knew that once the sun went down, they were essentially on their own. The jungle swallowed everything: bullets, bombs, entire platoons, and the darkness made it worse. When the sun set, the sea closed in. In the early 1960s, a handful of Air Force officers proposed something radical, drawing on ideas that traced back to a 1926 concept and to World War II male pilots who had demonstrated that a pilot flying in a banked circle could keep a fixed point on the ground continuously in his sights. They suggested abandoning the fast jet model entirely for certain missions. The proposal was simple in theory and revolutionary in practice. Take a slow, steady aircraft, mount guns on its side, and fly it in a continuous circle around the target. The pilot banks left, the guns fire left, and instead of a split-second strafing pass, you get minutes, even hours, of sustained, accurate fire on a single point. The aircraft they chose was the most available, most proven airframe in the inventory, the C-47 Skytrain, the military workhorse version of the Douglas DC-3 commercial airliner. First flown in the 1930s, it had carried paratroopers over Normandy. Now it would carry miniguns over the Mekong Delta. Over 50 C-47s would eventually be converted for service in Vietnam. The AC-47s became operational in December 1965 at Tan Son Nha Tut Air Base, assigned to the 1st Air Commando Squadron and the 4th Air Commando Squadron. They would fly missions from bases stretching the length of South Vietnam: Da Nang, Pleiku, Nha Trang, Bien Hoa, Can Tho. South Vietnamese forces called the aircraft the Dragonship. American GIs watching from their foxholes would give it a different name, one that stuck. And here's the thing that made Puff fundamentally different from every other aircraft in Vietnam. But names and history don't explain what Puff actually did. To understand that, you need to understand the machine itself and the men who flew it into the most dangerous airspace on Earth. The AC-47 carried 3 General Electric Su-E-11A miniguns mounted on the left side of the fuselage. Each minigun was a rotating 6-barreled weapon capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute. 3 guns combined meant 18,000 rounds per minute. That is 300 rounds every single second leaving the aircraft. The plane carried 24,000 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition, enough for roughly 80 seconds of continuous fire, which sounds brief until you understand what those 80 seconds could do. The signature tactic was the pylon turn. The pilot banked left into a continuous, tight orbit around the target. The 3 miniguns, fixed to fire out the left side at a downward angle, remained locked on the target area throughout the entire turn. Unlike a fast jet making a single pass, the AC-47 could orbit a target for extended periods, circling, firing, circling, firing. It achieved accuracy and sustained coverage that faster, more modern aircraft simply could not match. The aviators called it a pylon turn. The men on the ground called it salvation. The AC-47 also carried illumination flares, which crew members would ignite and toss out the cargo door. These flares drifted down on parachutes, turning the night jungle into a ghostly, swaying landscape of light and shadow. For the first time, defenders could see what was coming at them in the dark. The flares solved the fundamental problem that had plagued night defense: the enemy's invisibility. Imagine a weapon system where a World War II cargo plane flies in lazy circles over a battlefield, pouring 300 rounds per second into an area the size of a football field, while dropping artificial suns that turn midnight into noon. That was Puff. But for all its devastating power, Puff had a secret, one its crews knew intimately and tried not to think about. The AC-47 was poorly armored, essentially unarmored. The fuselage was the same thin aluminum skin as the original DC-3. A single well-placed round from a rifle could, and sometimes did, bring one down. The aircraft flew low and slow by necessity, low enough for accurate fire, slow enough for the sustained orbit. This meant it was within range of virtually every weapon the enemy possessed, from AK-47 rifles to heavy machine guns. Salvation or slaughter, the line between them was measured in altitude. The heavy ammunition load further restricted the aircraft's range and speed, requiring frequent returns to base for refueling and rearming. Crews knew the trade-off they were making every time they lifted off: devastating firepower in exchange for flying a slow, unprotected target in a sky full of people trying to kill them. The old transport airframe was never designed for combat. Its crews were flying what amounted to a dump truck full of ammunition through a gauntlet of ground fire, with nothing between them and an AK-47 round but a quarter-inch of aluminum. The crew composition reflected the AC-47's unconventional nature: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, flight engineer, loadmasters, and gunners. These were not fighter jockeys. Many were cargo pilots reassigned to a combat role they had never trained for, now flying in circles over hostile territory at low altitude, feeding belt after belt of ammunition into weapons that heated the cabin to unbearable temperatures. The brass casings piled up on the deck. The noise was beyond anything they had experienced. And through it all, they maintained the steady, methodical orbit that kept the guns on target. Now shift your attention to the other side. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had developed effective tactics against American air power: dispersal, tunnel systems, waiting out airstrikes, shooting at low-flying helicopters. They had a doctrine for dealing with fast jets: take cover, wait for the pass, resume operations. It worked. It worked against nearly every aircraft the Americans sent. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for an aircraft that did not leave. An aircraft that circled overhead like a bird of prey, raining fire continuously, illuminating their positions with flares so bright they cast shadows in the jungle. The tactical playbook that had worked against every other American aircraft was useless against Puff. The nickname came from the soldiers watching below. They saw the streams of tracer rounds. Every fifth round was a tracer, meaning the visible stream represented only a fraction of the actual fire, and the red rivers of light pouring from the aircraft reminded them of a dragon breathing fire. Someone made the connection to the popular Peter, Paul and Mary song, Puff the Magic Dragon. The name stuck instantly. There was something darkly comic about naming the most terrifying weapon in the sky after a children's folk song. What happened next would rewrite the rules of close air support forever. By late 1965, Puff was operational. The crews were ready. The enemy had no idea what was coming, and the first time the Dragon breathed, it announced itself with a massacre. The sun drops behind the tree line, and the jungle exhales. The temperature barely changes. It is Vietnam. It is always hot, but the quality of the air shifts. It becomes heavier, denser. The insects crescendo into a wall of sound, and somewhere out in that darkening green maze, hundreds of Viet Cong fighters are checking their weapons, tightening their sandals, and preparing to do what they have done a dozen times before: attack after dark, kill quickly, and disappear before the American planes come at dawn. The scene is a South Vietnamese outpost, a small fortified position. February 1965. Perimeter wire catches the last light. Radio operators monitor frequencies, listening for the reports they know are coming. Movement in the surrounding jungle. Enemy assembling in the tree line. The defenders have been through this before. The playbook is familiar and grim. The enemy attacks at night with concentrated force against an isolated position, hoping to overrun the perimeter before air support can arrive. By the time the jets come, if they come, the fight is usually over, one way or another. The radio call goes out, a request for air support, but this time, what is coming is not an F-100 Super Sabre or a pair of Huey gunships. This time, something new is lumbering off the runway at Tan Son Hoot, a converted cargo plane loaded with ammunition and crewed by men who have never done this in combat before. Nobody on that outpost, American or Vietnamese, had any idea that the aircraft droning toward them was about to change the nature of the war. The AC-47 reaches the area of operations. Below, the outpost is a constellation of muzzle flashes and tracer fire. The defenders' return fire is thin, scattered, clearly outgunned. The Viet Cong fire is dense and converging on the perimeter. The pilot identifies the outpost, identifies the enemy positions by their firing signatures, and begins the bank into the left-hand orbit. The loadmaster drops the first flare out the cargo door. It tumbles through the humid air, catches, ignites, and blooms white-hot. The jungle below is suddenly, shockingly visible. Trees cast sharp shadows. The darkness peels away like a curtain being ripped open. And then the sound. Not individual gunshots, not the rhythmic thumping of a helicopter's door gun. A continuous, tearing roar, like fabric being ripped apart by a giant, amplified to a volume that makes the air itself vibrate. A sound that does not start and stop. It simply is. For the Viet Cong on the ground, this is new. The guerrillas have survived air attacks before. Their procedure is drilled into them. Take cover, stay low, wait for the plane to make its pass, move when it banks away. But this plane does not pass. It circles. The fire does not stop. The flares keep the jungle lit. And the bullets, the sheer incomprehensible volume of bullets, are unlike anything they have ever experienced. The ground in the kill zone churns like water being stirred. Trees splinter along their entire length. Earthen walls disintegrate. There is no pause, no gap in which to move or breathe or think. The result of this early engagement, more than 300 Viet Cong killed in minutes, a single aircraft, a converted cargo plane. In the time it takes to brew a pot of coffee, 300 men ceased to exist. That was the announcement. That was the moment the Viet Cong learned that the night no longer belonged to them. But this was just the beginning. The real test, the engagement that would prove Puff's worth beyond any doubt, was still to come. As AC-47s began flying regular missions from bases across South Vietnam, word spread on both sides. American and South Vietnamese outpost commanders began requesting Puff by name. The aircraft became the most sought-after close air support platform in the theater. When Puff was on station, the perimeter held. When it was not available, the night was long and uncertain. On the other side, captured Viet Cong documents and prisoner interrogations began to reveal something remarkable. The enemy was becoming afraid. Not of aircraft in general, they were accustomed to being bombed and strafed, but of this particular aircraft and its unrelenting, inescapable fire. Tactical orders were being issued instructing fighters on what to do when the dragon ship appeared. The most common instruction was simple: disengage and withdraw. Do not fight it. Leave. Soldiers who had seen Puff work described the same thing over and over, a continuous river of red light pouring down from the circling aircraft like molten metal being poured from a crucible. The visible stream was only a fraction of the actual fire. For every glowing tracer, 4 invisible rounds accompanied it. The visible stream was terrifying enough. The invisible volume was annihilating. The silence afterward felt sacred, because it meant you were alive and the people trying to kill you were not. Then came December 23rd, a small outpost, the Mekong River Delta, and a Viet Cong force about to learn the hardest lesson of the war. The Tran Yen outpost sits on the Mekong River Delta, a small fortified South Vietnamese position. Sandbag walls, concertina wire, a handful of defenders dwarfed by the surrounding landscape. The Mekong stretches nearby, flat and silver in the fading light. Rice paddies extend in every direction, broken by trey lines and low dike walls. A lonely place. A place where the horizon offers no comfort, only more open ground with no reinforcements in sight. A vulnerable place. The Viet Cong guerrillas who have targeted this outpost are experienced fighters. They have attacked positions exactly like this before. Their doctrine is proven and reliable. Mass at the perimeter, breach the wire, overwhelm the defenders before air support can arrive, strip the outpost of weapons and supplies, and withdraw. They have done this successfully many times. They are accustomed to surviving American air power. Wait for the pass, move between the gaps. The jets are fast, their attacks are brief, and the darkness provides cover between strafing runs. Nightfall. The guerrillas move into position through the paddies and tray lines. Inside the wire, the defenders hear the sounds, snapping twigs, the metallic clink of weapons being readied, whispered commands that carry across the flat water with unnatural clarity. Flare pistols are readied behind the sandbags. Radio operators begin transmitting requests for support, their voices tight with controlled urgency. The familiar dread of a night attack settles over the outpost like the humidity that never lifts. The men inside the wire know what is coming. They have heard the stories from other outposts, the ones that were overrun, the ones where they found the bodies at dawn. They check their ammunition, they check their fields of fire, and they check the sky, hoping. The attack begins. Muzzle flashes erupt from the tree line in a ragged semicircle. Mortar rounds thump from their tubes and whistle overhead. The perimeter wire sparks where bullets strike it. The volume of incoming fire makes it immediately clear. This is a major assault, not a probe. The radio operator's voice rises. They need air support, and they need it now. What the Viet Cong didn't know, couldn't have known, was that their timing was catastrophically unlucky. An AC-47 has just been deployed to this sector. It is already airborne, already loaded, already turning toward the coordinates crackling through the radio. The crew, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, gunners, loadmaster, run through their pre-engagement checks. Ammunition belts are inspected. The miniguns are charged. The aircraft banks southeast toward the Mekong Delta, engines droning through the humid night air. The AC-47 reaches the area of operations, and the pilot reads the battlefield below. The outpost flickers with the thin fire of its defenders, clearly outgunned, clearly desperate. The Viet Cong fire converges from multiple directions, dense and disciplined. The pilot begins the bank into the orbit, and the loadmaster drops the first flare out the cargo door. It tumbles, catches, and ignites, and the Mekong Delta below is suddenly bathed in harsh white light. Shadows leap into existence across the paddies. The flat water reflects the glare like a mirror. The tree line where the Viet Cong are massed becomes starkly, nakedly visible. For men accustomed to the protection of darkness, this is the first shock. They can be seen. The guerrillas look up at the flare, squinting. They have seen flares before. They know the response. Stay low, keep firing, the flare will burn out, the darkness will return. But then the sound reaches them, that continuous unearthly roar. Before they can process what it is, the ground around them erupts. Here is what those guns do, stated in the cold language of ballistics. The firepower covers an elliptical area approximately 52 yards in diameter. During a 3-second burst, a round lands every 2.4 yards within that ellipse. There is no gap, there is no safe space within the kill zone. Every square yard receives fire within seconds. The rounds shred vegetation, punch through earthen dikes, splinter wood, and tear through anything standing in the open. The tracer rounds, glowing red, create the visual effect that gives the aircraft its name, a solid stream of fire connecting the circling plane to the earth below, as if the aircraft is breathing flame. A river of fire pouring from the heavens. For the defenders inside the outpost, the sight is almost religious. That cascading fire directed with terrible precision at the positions that were, moments ago, killing them. The incoming fire slackens, then it falters, then it stops. Inside the AC-47, the gunners feed ammunition belts into the weapons, which heat the aircraft's interior to temperatures that make the air shimmer. Spent brass cascades across the deck in a golden torrent. The noise is beyond description. Even through headsets and ear protection, the gunners feel it in their chests, in their teeth. The loadmaster prepares another flare. The pilot maintains the bank, his calm voice on the radio adjusting the orbit based on reports from the ground. The aircraft holds steady, methodical, professional. Below it, the scene is anything but. But here's where it gets insane, because the Viet Cong did something unexpected. Unlike at previous engagements, the Viet Cong at Tran Yen do not withdraw. Not immediately. Whether it is because they are pinned, because they do not yet understand what they are facing, or because their commanders believe the fire will pause like a conventional airstrike, they hold their positions. They try to ride it out. It is a fatal miscalculation. The AC-47 continues its orbit. The fire does not stop. The Viet Cong wait for the pause, the gap between passes that every other American aircraft has given them. The gap does not come. Banking into its deadly orbit, the Dragon circles, and the fire is continuous. Another flare drops, replacing the one burning out. The night remains lit. The jungle remains exposed. The fire didn't stop. That was the part nobody was prepared for. Even disciplined, hardened soldiers, men who had survived years of jungle warfare, who had endured the B-52 strikes of arc light, the napalm runs, the helicopter gunships, break under this sustained onslaught. The mere sound of the miniguns induces a visceral terror that transcends tactical calculation. This is not a battle they can fight. They cannot shoot back effectively at an aircraft they can barely see in the darkness above the flares. They cannot take cover because there is no cover. The rounds penetrate everything in the kill zone. They cannot wait for the attack to end because it does not end. And they cannot run because the moment they move, they are visible in the flare light and the guns follow. This is where the Viet Cong's entire tactical doctrine, the doctrine that had confounded the most powerful military on Earth for years, falls apart. Everything they know about surviving American air power depends on one assumption, that the attack will be brief. When that assumption fails, their options collapse to one: die or flee. The Viet Cong finally break. The withdrawal that should have been orderly becomes a rout. Fighters abandon positions, weapons, wounded comrades. They run for the tray lines, for the canals, for any depression in the earth that will take them out of the kill zone. But the AC-47, drawing from its massive ammunition stores, simply adjusts its orbit following the retreat, extending the devastation. From the ground, the hiss of descending flares, the crackle of burning vegetation, the slapping sound of rounds hitting water in the paddies. The thin-skinned aircraft shudders momentarily under scattered return fire, then continues its orbit unperturbed. And then, as suddenly as it started, silence. The year is 1968. The place is Khe Sanh, and this is where the Dragon reaches its finest and most desperate hour. 6,000 Marines are surrounded by an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars. The base is under constant artillery shelling. The perimeter is probed nightly by sappers and infantry. The siege will last 77 days. This is not a guerrilla skirmish in the Delta. This is a full-scale conventional siege, and the Marines are in serious trouble. The AC-47s flying over Khe Sanh provide essential fire support, but they serve an equally critical role as a morale lifeline. At night, when NVA sappers probe the wire and the threat of human wave assaults looms over the perimeter, the Marines listen for the drone overhead. By now, the AC-47 has earned another nickname, Spooky, its official call sign. When those miniguns open up, the Marines cheer. The red streams of tracer fire above the perimeter become a signal. You are not alone. Someone is up there. The Dragon is watching for the besieged Marines at Khe Sanh. Puff was more than a weapons platform. It was a psychological lifeline, a visible, audible promise that they had not been abandoned. Its presence was potentially the decisive factor between holding the perimeter and being overrun during the worst of the nighttime assaults. But the crews flying those missions know something the Marines on the ground do not. Every orbit over Khe Sanh is a gamble with their lives. The NVA have anti-aircraft guns ringing the base, heavy weapons specifically positioned to destroy the slow-flying gunships. Flying low and exposed, as always, the AC-47 threads through a web of tracer fire, coming up even as its own tracer fire goes down. The crews can see the green tracers reaching for them, feel the airframe shudder when rounds connect. They fly anyway, every night. The bravery wasn't just on the ground. It was at 2,000 feet, in a plane made of aluminum and prayer. Not every mission ended in triumph. AC-47s were shot down. Crews were killed. The vulnerability that had been acknowledged from the very beginning extracted its price in blood. That thin aluminum skin that could not stop a rifle round. The slow speed that made them easy tracking targets. The low altitude that put them within reach of every weapon on the battlefield. Some crews were lost without a trace, shot down over jungles so dense the wreckage was never found. Others went down in fireballs visible for miles, their ammunition cooking off in the crash, turning the wreck into a secondary zone of destruction. The dragon could breathe fire. But the dragon could also bleed. When the guns finally fell silent, over Tran Yen, over Khe Sanh, over 100 nameless outposts scattered across the Vietnamese night, what was left told a story that numbers alone cannot capture. When the sun rises over the Mekong Delta after Puff has worked, the landscape is altered. The tree line that concealed the attackers is shredded, not damaged, shredded. Trees stand with their trunks intact, but every branch stripped away, as though a giant hand peeled the foliage from every limb. The ground in the kill zone is churned and pocked, the soil turned over by thousands of impacts into a moonscape of craters and furrows, and among the splintered wood and torn vegetation, the evidence of what 300 rounds per second applied to human beings actually means. Weapons are scattered across the ground, equipment abandoned in every direction. The disarray left in its wake tells the story of complete tactical collapse, not an orderly retreat but a panicked, headlong flight from something that could not be fought, could not be survived, could not be endured. Soldiers who walk the kill zone at dawn react differently. Some are awed by the sheer scope of the destruction. Some are sickened by what they find in the churned earth. Some feel nothing except the profound, bone-deep relief that those rounds were falling on someone else. A few pick up discarded equipment, a shattered rifle stock, a helmet with holes punched clean through it. Most just stare and try to comprehend the mathematics of sustained automatic fire applied at industrial scale. Across hundreds of engagements throughout the war, the AC-47 compiled a record that redefined what close air support could be. The Tran Yen engagement on the Mekong Delta. Hundreds dead in minutes, just as in those first terrifying tests. Khe Sanh, where nightly missions helped hold the perimeter through 77 days of siege. Outpost after outpost across the central highlands, the delta, the coastal plains. Wherever a position was under attack at night, the call went out for Puff, and when Puff arrived, the attack ended. Now consider 3 people who lived through this, one from each side of the experience. A South Vietnamese outpost soldier at Tran Yen, one of the men inside the wire that December night. He had survived night attacks before, but this one was different, not because of the ferocity of the enemy assault, that was familiar, but because of what stopped it. He describes looking up and seeing the river of fire and believing for a moment that the sky itself had caught fire. He does not know the aircraft's American nickname. He calls it what his comrades call it, the Gunship, and he says it is the reason he is alive. An AC-47 crew member, a loadmaster whose job was to kick flares out the cargo door and feed ammunition belts into smoking hot miniguns, while spent brass rolled underfoot like ball bearings on a tilting deck. He describes the heat inside the aircraft, the deafening noise even through ear protection, the surreal experience of circling in the dark while tracers red going out, green coming in, crisscrossed around the fuselage. He describes the smell, gunpowder, hydraulic fluid, sweat, and something metallic he could never quite identify. The smell of copper casings expanding in overheated barrels. A captured Viet Cong fighter interrogated after a Puff engagement. He describes the terror in clinical, almost flat terms, the way soldiers often describe the worst moments, as if the emotion has been burned out of the memory and only the facts remain. He says they were told it was just another aircraft. He says they were told to hold their positions. He says the fire came and it did not stop, and the men around him began to scream, and then began to run, and then began to die. He says he will never forget the sound. The news of PUF's effectiveness rippled through both armies and changed behavior on each side. On the American and South Vietnamese side, requests for AC-47 support skyrocketed. Outpost commanders who had previously felt abandoned when darkness fell now had a lifeline they could call on. Morale shifted measurably. The psychological impact on friendly forces was nearly as significant as the tactical impact, not because PUF won the war, but because it made the night survivable. On the enemy side, tactical adaptation was swift and pragmatic. The Viet Cong and NVA adjusted their doctrine. They learned to disengage immediately when the dragon ship appeared, rather than trying to ride out the attack. They positioned anti-aircraft weapons specifically to target the slow-flying gunships. They adjusted the timing and location of attacks to avoid known AC-47 patrol sectors. PUF did not just kill the enemy. It changed the way the enemy fought. A single weapons platform altered the tactical behavior of an entire insurgency. And beyond Vietnam, the AC-47 proved the gunship concept so decisively that it spawned an entire lineage of increasingly powerful successors. The AC-130 Spectre, which carries howitzers and Bofors cannons, is a direct descendant of PUF's concept. The idea that a slow-moving aircraft flying in circles could be more effective than a fast jet making passes, the idea that sounded absurd in the early 1960s, became permanent military doctrine. The dragon's fire never really went out. It just got bigger. But the battle's end was just the beginning of PUF's story, a story that did not end when the last AC-47 was retired, and one that raises questions we are still answering today. How PUF is remembered and misremembered tells us something about the strange alchemy of war and memory. The nickname itself is a study in the dark irony that soldiers use to survive the unsurvivable, naming an instrument of devastating killing power after a gentle children's folk song about a lovable dragon who frolicked in the autumn mist. The contrast between the sweet melody and the reality of what that aircraft did became one of the Vietnam War's most enduring pieces of dark folklore. It endures because the dissonance is the point. You name the most terrifying thing in the sky after a children's song, because if you called it what it actually was, you might not be able to climb aboard it and fly. Veterans who served during PUF's operational years described the aircraft with a reverence usually reserved for fellow soldiers, not for machines. It was not just an aircraft to them. It was a presence, a guardian, a promise written in red tracer fire across the night sky. The sound of its engines overhead meant you would probably live to see morning. That is a bond that transcends the mechanical. That is not a man's relationship with a weapons platform. That is a man's relationship with the thing that saved his life. But the AC-47 story also carries uncomfortable truths that resist simple celebration. The same firepower that saved American and South Vietnamese lives killed Vietnamese people. Combatants, certainly, but in a guerrilla war fought in populated areas, the line between combatant and non-combatant was never as clean as anyone wanted it to be. The mathematics of 52 yards of saturated fire in a war zone without clear front lines means that PUF's legacy, like the legacy of the war itself, is more complicated than any single narrative can contain. The dragon's breath did not ask questions once it left the gun barrels. The AC-47 was eventually phased out as the war evolved and more capable aircraft entered service. But its conceptual DNA lives on in every gunship that has flown since. At Khe Sanh and dozens of outposts like it, the decisive factor it had been proved the concept for an entirely new category of weapon. The AC-130 Spectre and its variants have served in every American conflict since Vietnam, from Grenada to Iraq to Afghanistan, carrying the same fundamental idea forward across decades: orbit, illuminate, saturate. The slow circle, the side-firing guns, the sustained presence over a battlefield that transforms the geometry of combat. A cargo plane from the 1930s rewrote the rules of modern warfare. The AC-47 proved something that military planners had resisted for years, that in certain kinds of war, slow is better than fast, sustained is better than powerful, and presence, the simple, terrifying fact of being there and not leaving, is more decisive than precision. It was a lesson learned in blood and fire over the jungles of Vietnam, taught by an aircraft that had no business being in combat and changed everything because it was. Return now to the image from the beginning. The 19-year-old soldier in the foxhole, the one watching the river of red fire pour from the sky. He knows now what he is looking at. He knows the name. He knows the sound, that tearing roar that means the night has shifted in his favor. And for the rest of his life, whenever he hears the word dragon, he will not think of fairy tales. He will think of a night in Vietnam when the darkness was killing him, and a cargo plane, a Douglas DC-3, the kind of plane your grandfather might have flown on to visit relatives in Chicago, saved his life by breathing fire. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this waiting to be told.